So I get to start, and there's a clock right here. So oh, that's okay. So there's a clock. So thank you. So this is meant to warm us up and not be profound. That will be easy for me to do that, to not be. So this slide is to say thank you to everybody. The most important part of thanking everybody is that, so this is the third year, so thank you for coming. And it's getting a little easier, I think, except I fear it's not. That is, I had more fun than the other 2 years thinking about it. And then I went away, and Carissa did everything. So whenever you get a chance, there were lots of people that also helped, and they're thanked in the brochures, and there's sponsors who we thank. But when you see Carissa, you should sneak up on her and hug her, because she did something, again, really, truly remarkable. Okay, so that's a thank you. The first thing is from last year. I said you'd have to be certifiably crazy. Many of you are, but that's okay. The purpose of this talk is I want to talk about healthcare in the context of the other biggies, the other things we spend a lot of money on, energy and defense, because I've been reading, in my spare time, I've been reading about energy and defense. And I think there's some lessons. And then I want to talk a little bit about omics, of course. And then I'll get to Narcissomics. And I will finish with one of the single best slides that any of you have ever seen. That's a promise. Okay? Discovered in France. So here's a quote to remember from Margaret Mead. And of course, she was unique, right? There she was, being unique. The number of us who have been photographed like that is 0. But it's a great thing to remember. So the whole point I'm going to try to make in this talk is that the tension between your narcissistic self and your self of the commons, your worse self and your better self, so to speak. You need to be your worst self to do anything, but you got to be your better self to do it right, something like that. So I'm going to talk about that. And because I'm the oldest person in the room, I get to be a silly person. That's not funny. So the 3 biggies: defense, energy, and healthcare. So I sort of made a few slides. It's just, high-level stuff, of course, because I don't really know this stuff. But when you think about it, and you compare how we're doing at healthcare versus how the world does at defense and energy, we're doing worse in healthcare, in case you haven't figured it out. We spend about this, big dollars. So why is that? What is so hard about this healthcare thing, besides the fact that biology is complicated, which is true? And so here's a few thoughts, right? That you have a command structure. A command structure. Can you imagine a command structure in biology research? Can you imagine if I went to the lab and told somebody to do something? It would guarantee that it would not be done. In fact, they would do the opposite, and rightfully so, because the whole premise is no command structure, I think. Energy is handled pretty well because they're big guys, and they're not messing around. I mean, one of the biggest miracles of all, if you think of it that way, is that when the BP oil spill happened, they didn't go out of business. And that's a remarkable thing. If you don't think that's remarkable, you're not paying attention. I mean, it's just remarkable. And then there's healthcare, which I claim is done poorly. So then here's a little more. There's a big infrastructure for defense. Funding is there. That's a little joke, right? Rocket science. Okay, so it is. Energy, the infrastructure and funding also exist. It's real. And there's a big problem coming, but nobody's worrying about how long it takes, actually, even though some people are, not many. And when it happens, and there's a green energy system, the guys that are making money now are going to be making money then. So they're not going to miss it, right? They're not going to say, oh no, we didn't see it coming. So it'll happen. And in healthcare, there's none of that, absolutely none of it. Balkanized, best practices, none of it exists. And I mean, it doesn't exist in the same city, let alone in the same, in the world. Okay? And then you have this problem of innovation, which is what I really want to also talk about, which is that the defense guys can't afford to not fund new technologies, because if they don't, they're going to lose. So this is a zero-sum game, the way they perceive it. And failures are okay, because all that matters is that you compete. Energy is a little bit less like that. But boy, when you get to healthcare, it is tough. So, and the people with all the money, I claim, are not the experts. So that's a problem that you have to think of. So it's really interesting that these three gigantic, to me anyway, these three gigantic enterprises, I think the only one that I would have included maybe as a fourth might have been food, maybe. That's a big deal. Again, largely balkanized, so it's more like healthcare, I think, than the other two. So this infrastructure, I tried to get Jim Surowiecki to come, and then we got confused, and it didn't happen, so we'll try again next year. And this article that he wrote, for those of you who are like to read things that other people suggest, there's a great article from last year that I got all excited about because it told us how much simpler healthcare improvements should be than they are. And in the year since this was published, it made no difference, of course. And we're not any better off today than last year. That's why we'll be able to say time is fleeing until there are no more symposia, until I'm fleeing, for example, fleed. Okay, I will get to that in a minute. So here is the heart of it, I think. If I were asking you to take notes, which I'm not because I don't care, I think this is the heart of it. And as research scientists, we don't remember this. This was written because I am reading a lot about alternative energies and stuff. This was in Daedalus. It was just last quarter. And Challenges for Technical Change. Well, that's a good title. That's the title for everything. I mean, it faces us in every one of these big areas. So read the bottom bullet. I'm not going to read it to you. It tells you the important observation that technology is never the ultimate step. At best, it's the penultimate step. That's what this whole article is about. It makes sense, because it doesn't make any difference for anybody until you solve the problems, as it says, in the province of the social sciences. All of these things are social. And you get through it in the Army by having a command structure, and so the social part of it is different. And you get through it in energy because the guys are so big, so they can do what they think they ought to do. But when you're in a balkanized system, the notion of doing something that is deployment at a scale that makes a difference is very difficult. And I think that is the heart of the problem. So, you know, David Lawrence, who's here again, and I'm so grateful to that. We've talked about this for many, many hours, and I doubt that he agrees with this. He always tells me that he thinks the problem is the egos of doctors. I'm sorry, David, to say that in front of you, since you are a doctor, and all the other doctors will dislike you for me saying that today. But I think the real problem is that this transition from some great idea to something that makes a difference is very, very tough and is slow. So last year I showed this slide. When you think about what we're going to do today, we always are going to do, until I get tired of it, omics, because omics is the ball game for evidence. So last night at the little welcoming dinner we had a wonderful conversation with a wonderful guy who's thinking about traumatic brain injury and about all the different modalities that one might do to help with that. It was a terrific talk, that little one-on-one discussion. And in the end, in order to do things that make a difference to lots of people, you're going to have to use evidence that is standard rules of epistemology. If you don't, then you're just going to be in a marketing game of some kind. So omics is the thing. And at this meeting, we have people who are going to talk about proteomics, a guy whose career makes me shudder with jealousy. We're going to hear about metabolomics, another guy whose career makes me shudder with jealousy. And so we're going to have fun hearing about these advances in the penultimate stages of fixing healthcare. That's the way I view it. So this is then what we're going to talk about for the next 2 days, this conversion of omics and a sensible medical infrastructure. Still elusive. So I want to then switch a little teeny bit, just for another few minutes, about the demographics as I see it, because there's a thing I touched on last year that I now understand better and have checked with my deepest economist friend, who told me, A, that this was right, what I'm about to show you, and B, all economists know it, and C, he couldn't come and talk about it because he happens to be the president of Yale and their graduation is this weekend, so there you go. I told him he made a bad choice, but he didn't. So I showed this slide last year and made lots of jokes about how I was on the descending part of the red curve, and I pointed to it and said, I'm down here, and never mind, and that the goal of precision or personalized medicine is to extend the high quality of your life as a child, if you should be so lucky to start that way, which of course is not always the case, to extend that kind of uninterrupted until you plunge quickly and painlessly to the end. That was what we all agreed that we would like that, and only disagreed about the slope of that descent. Some wanted it to take a week, some a day, some a minute, some a month, but nobody wanted it to take 14 years. And so there's an idea. So I've been thinking about this graph since I made it up. You can tell I just drew it with my hand. And this is another way of thinking about that graph. Think about our lives today. And so, you know, there are kids that go to college, and they start doing productive work in the world when they're, you know, unless you count working the way I worked through high school, that was just fooling around, I think. The time of your productive work is kind of the middle 40 years in these developed cultures. The front end and the back end are all about expenses, from parents on the one hand, and the society, if you should live in a society that can do it, on the back end. And we did this math last year, and to me, this is like startling. I mean, well, if you were going to pay without inflation for the first part of your life and the last part, you'd have to have a 50% tax on everything you made. Just, it's math, right? Just simple math. Wow. So we're not going to do that. So, but nobody knows how to do it. And economists talk about this all the time. The reason that people want to raise the age at which you can retire and get Social Security is simply to shorten this period. And you can, let me stop that, and yes, okay. So this is well understood. And this is the way it used to be. So you have to think about it. You know, we're an evolving species, and we cleaned up the water, we learned about antibiotics, and that was good. And what we did was we pushed the time of death from kind of 60 to 80 and said, let's retire and enjoy the full life we've earned without ever figuring out how to pay for it. So it used to be that, and you see how the expense thing is so cleverly made a little smaller. The idea was that when you were 5 years old, you'd walk around and you'd pick peas with your parents who were farming, and you'd pick, with the Hadza Bushmen, you'd go out and you'd pick things, and you'd take care of the animals, and you'd feed your dogs, and you'd clean up after yourself. And so the idea was that when you were children once, not so long ago, maybe 100 years, You participated in the life of the family in a different way, and then you died before you got your benefits. Duh. So the math of that is, let me say the math. The math is really simple. It's down at the bottom. We used to spend 55/60ths of our life doing something productive in GDP terms, and now we spend half. There's something wrong about that. I mean, you know, so the question is, what do you do about it? And nobody knows how to solve this problem. If you try to make it so that people retire 2 years later, you can't be the president of France any longer. This is the way it works, okay? And what we claim we want is this. What we claim we want is another 20 years on the public dole. That's what we want, more expense. So we want longer lives. So I don't have anything useful to say about this, except it's a big problem, and you got to think about it. You just have to think about it. And you have to think about it not as your narcissistic self, but as your commons self, because if you think about it narcissistically, you want that. If you don't want that, you're not paying attention, and you certainly want it for your children and all that stuff. So we all want to live a long time. So one of my favorite quotes is this one. This is a quote from Linus Pauling. Tom Manyatis told me this the other day. And of course, it's true. Because if you don't use that banister, Linus, at age 94, you're going to slip, and that's it. You know, you break your hip, and it's all over. And so that's for you. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit now, finally, about this Narcissomics idea. Okay. So everybody sort of agrees that I agree with myself that this is the province of the social sciences. And now we got to figure out how to get data and solve the social science problem. So one of the big trends that's happening is that people are beginning to think that clinical work can be done on a smaller scale than we used to think. 10,000 people is a big clinical trial for a drug for you know, how much longer people will live with breast cancer. You got to do big trials. And since the emphasis now is to try to figure out if you can find things early enough so that the interventions are simple, which is not going to always work, but will work some of the time. Certainly for cancers, it may work a large fraction of the time. The real question is, how do you get to the earliest possible detection, earliest possible detection, so that you can do something about it. And there's this paper that probably half the people in this room have read. It was published in Nature by Mike Snyder from Stanford, which is where the word the narcissome comes from, because a wag, not me, I didn't make this up, in writing about his paper called it the narcissome. And what he did was simple. He just took blood from himself and analyzed it every month for a while, a year and a half, something like that. And it wasn't profound, because he didn't find an enormously important thing, but it was an example, I think, of what's going to happen. And of course, the real question is, how many people with careful longitudinal data sets would we need to actually understand what would be, say, early detection of something? And I'll show you right now that it's not many. And we think about this all the time at my day job. So here's an idea. This is from the SomaLogic slide decks. That if you had longitudinal data, you could kind of get an alert at some time. Hello, go see doctor, go to the, it's sort of like your bathroom scale. Nobody needs a prescription to weigh themselves or measure their blood pressure. And the world of omics, I think, is moving toward something that will be on the edge of medicine, maybe helping people enter the medical system with a little bit more knowledge than they have today. Now what they have is a fear or a symptom of some kind. So this slide also is one we've shown. So let me explain what a longitudinal, there are people in this room with whom we've had this conversation 1,000 times. just look at the bottom of this funny slide. This is why large biobanks are needed. Okay, a public slide. So if you had blood from 1 million people, and you put their blood away once a year for 10 years, just make it up. There is no such biobank on this earth today. There should be, but there is not. So then what would you do? You'd have medical records, you'd do that, and for 1 million people, you'd have 500,000 women, and the rate of getting ovarian cancer, if you're not a mutation prone to it, like BRCA1 or BRCA2, is about 1 in 10,000 ballpark. So from those 500,000 women whose blood is being put away every year, 50 would be diagnosed in any year with ovarian cancer. And when that happened, you'd be able to go and get the blood and look at it from that year, the previous year, the previous year, the previous year, and then you'd be able to get controls from across the street with the same environment, the same number of children. So you'd have essentially, with those 50 people, and 50 people who were the controls, and 5 samples each, that's 500 samples. So at SomaLogic, we could do that in a week. So in a week, made up, not the week, because the samples don't exist, but if they did, you could do in a week, you would know what those 50 women's blood shared. Be done with it, unless it didn't work. But if it didn't work, then you'd do some other disease. And so you could keep working toward this idea of early detection, in this case being a disease where early detection would be life-saving. Okay? So we've actually fooled with that a little bit. This is one of these funny, it's not meant to be advertising. So we've looked at heavy smokers with a classifier that we've built at SomaLogic, and we've got longitudinal samples from people who were studied every year. So this is a metaphor for this discussion. Just a metaphor, because it's for sure not done. Okay? I can't promise you that we could see this in every person. We could not. I'm sure of that. And the blue dots are a person who was a heavy smoker who over time was not diagnosed with lung cancer. And the red dots are a person who was. And before they were diagnosed, in the blood, there was this climbing signal that said you might have had a shot at an earlier intervention, is the idea. And I think that's the kind of thing that will lead to smaller, longitudinal kind of investigations of people. So from the narcissome, it says, to the menizome, or something like that. And that'll be part of the penultimate step prior to deployment at a scale that makes a difference. That's what I think. So I'm ready to get there. So for these 2 days, we're going to do some omics, we're going to do some drugs, we're going to do some immunology, we're going to do the usual mix of stuff. And we've asked all the speakers to speak English. If you don't, Dick McIntosh will raise his hand and say something like, "What?" Or someone else will. I will if he doesn't, somebody will. We have to, because the whole idea here is to create a kind of a cadre, an ecosystem of people who understand that this is more than technology, and it's about, as I keep saying, our better selves. So I have one slide that I'd like to leave you with, and I'd like to tell you a story. The best graduation speech I ever heard, I didn't give it, of course, but I heard. It was Sergeant Shriver at my son's graduation from Yale, and he was talking to a class of 1,000 undergraduates who were, what's the word I'm looking for? Entitled. This is the right word. They were entitled, are entitled. And he wanted to give them advice to last forever. And he said, "Throw away your mirrors." Pretty great speech, I thought. So this is what I would like you to go look on the web and paste it on the mirror you're not throwing away, so that when you look at the mirror, instead of seeing your handsome selves, you see this wonderful sculpture from this guy who was actually the grandson of Karl Marx, believe it or not. And I was with my daughter Emily last week, and we saw this thing in this place in Colmar, south of Strasbourg. And I think that just says it all. And it says more than all, because for some of you in this room, you can't believe I would show that picture, and you wonder what I've seen in that picture. I don't know what I've seen in this picture, but I know that I can't get that picture out of my face and brain, and it's going to be on my mirror for the rest of my life. So I'm done. So let's have a good time. Feel free to interrupt as we go, okay?